It's okay. Who are there many people in that group? Okay, so we can't figure out. Okay. Then I'll just leave it here. I'll left it here so that
Yeah. Hello, welcome. Standing back there, please come on in if you're interested in this landscape standards session. We're going to get started, and I'm going to be moderating the Q&A also, so I'll be up here. But Dave Kramer with Verra is going to be starting us off, I think, and he's welcome to invite people to come up forward also. And to okay, good afternoon. Welcome. Feel free to file into the front row. We're not scary, but we're really thankful that you've come to this corner with so many other events happening in this awesome conference. As Louis mentioned, my name is David Kramer. I am the senior manager for the landscape standard at Verra, and here today to tell you more about the landscape standard. Landscape standard, as you can see here, is a collaboration between 3 organizations in the Secretariat and several organizations that are focused on piloting and testing the work on the ground. We'll tell you a lot more about it as we go through, but just briefly, the people you'll be hearing from today are Joanna Durbin from the director of the Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Alliance, right here. Nigel Sizer, the Chief Program Officer at Rainforest Alliance. And John Willem de Besten, hope I pronounced your name okay, from the Senior Green Expert Finance at IUCN. Myself, as I mentioned, and Louis, who is the master of ceremonies in this whole pavilion and is going to be moderating and helping cultivate the questions that you all ask and are thinking about. But without further ado, I think I'm going to pass it on to Joanna Durbin, who's going to help us understand, to begin with, why a landscape standard. And we'll talk about what we mean by the landscape standard as we go on.
Thank you. So my role here is to talk about what's the purpose of this, where is it coming from, so and what's it for. We'll get into more details on what it is later. So demand for commodities can only go up. Even now, production is unsustainable, and pressures will only increase. So commodity production, much of it for global markets, is the major driver of deforestation and is destroying other natural ecosystems. It's damaging the capacity to provide critical services, water supplies, etc., and makes a quarter of the contribution to the greenhouse gases for contributing to climate change, as well as all the biodiversity and other cultural values of forests. So deforestation and other ecosystem conversion can't be tackled in a piecemeal way, farm by farm, or by companies striving to reduce the footprint of their supply chain. And it needs collective action across landscapes. Oh, thank you. So many companies, governments, producers and communities are recognizing the need to tackle sustainability at a landscape level. We're hearing a lot about landscape approaches, jurisdictional approaches. So the landscape standard aims to provide them with credible and robust information about the outcomes of collective actions across whole landscapes, assessing sustainability across dimensions. So environmental, social, economic, governance, across sectors, and beyond a single supply chain or investment. So here I'm going to talk you through, like, what is this for and who might use it. So the key stakeholders that we're talking about are the landscape actors within the landscape, the governments, producers, and civil society, and then the people outside the landscape, the external kind of commodity companies, development finance institutions, investors, and governments. And the landscape standard is essentially a communication tool between these different levels of actors. So within the landscape, they're using this kind of holistic assessment framework to measure and communicate sustainability progress as a means to help them attract finance and investments and incentives. And then on the external side, companies need to meet their supply chain commitments on reducing deforestation or zero deforestation. There are environmental, social, and governance safeguards, that investment institutions need to follow. There are landscape level issues that affect their decision making about production or investment and reputational risk. So the idea is that with this information that they're getting about the broader landscape, beyond their own supply chain, it will help them to either scale up sourcing from landscapes that are doing better, but more importantly, we actually want them to increase partnership and engagement and support for these collective actions. And also sort of scale up investment. So in that way, providing the incentives for these groups that are in the landscape to implement more coordinated strategies and activities that drive the results at the landscape scale. And collectively then resulting in the landscapes that we want, that are managed so that communities and ecosystems thrive and provide viable long-term supplies of the world's primary commodities. So that's the kind of theory of change and the logic behind it. I'm going to hand over to Nigel to talk a bit more about why different people would use this, particularly the external actors in this case.
Thanks, Joanna. Great to see you all. I'm very happy to be here speaking about this. It's wonderful to be here with Verra, CCBA, IUCN. There are several other partners involved, ProForest and others. It's a very important initiative for us at Rainforest Alliance for the sorts of reasons that Joanna was talking about as we reach out beyond farms and specific supply chains to the wider landscapes. We obviously, from our narrow Rainforest Alliance perspective, have a long and strong history working on farm-level certification programs for tea, coffee, cocoa, and so on and so on. This really complements that by getting out to the wider set of processes and indicators and measures across a whole landscape or a whole jurisdiction. So let's see. So how do we see this being used, and what is the demand for this? We've obviously had a lot of discussions with different actors and stakeholders who are excited about this. So on the corporate side, of course, there is growing commitment and interest and risk associated with dealing with landscape scale issues. It's increasingly no longer sufficient for a company to be saying these specific farms that we are working with are being well managed if they're coming from a wider landscape where you've got very high risks of child labor or illegal chemicals use, large-scale deforestation that can be leaking into the specific supply chain you're working with, or at least tarnishing the image and the reputation of the areas you're looking at. So look at what's happening with cocoa in West Africa, for example. So there's a very strong corporate interest in being able to make some sorts of claims and contribution to landscape scale change. We also see this very strongly in a parallel initiative that many of us are involved with called the Accountability Framework, which is developing a set of principles for ethical supply chains. And that's very, very consistent with what's emerging here with the landscape standard. It will provide the companies with real data, objective data and information which can support claims that they want to make that can be verified about what is happening across those landscapes, and give them the ability to also identify areas where there's higher risk. So this is key for them in managing risk and in making claims. So sort of the positive and negative side of these processes. For donors and governments, this is also potentially very important. Governments increasingly want to demonstrate that they're making progress in addressing these issues on a landscape or jurisdictional scale. And donors want to reward that and partner with that. And they also want to know whether their investments are working. So this is key for that as well. Again, providing them with high quality data consistently developed with strong support from a whole range of actors around sort of the integrity and approach behind that, and supporting communication about the progress that's being made or not, depending on what's happening. And then you've got the development agencies and investors and others as well, who want to understand really what's going on across these different landscapes, to compare and contrast and manage and assess the risks, and allocate their investments accordingly. So this is another key part of that. And then sort of in addition to all of this, some of the other actors that Joanna was talking about, clearly this is also valuable for civil society and advocacy groups who would want to be building accountability mechanisms around progress towards the commitments that many are making. And for researchers and academics who are trying to study and understand the patterns and dynamics, why are certain landscapes doing much better on certain aspects than others? What's going on there, and how can we learn from where there is success, better identify the bright spots, and build on those experiences? So those are just a few points on the demand and how we see this being used. Who's next?
Thanks, Nigel. Grab your yours. Okay, so just a little more detail on what is the landscape standard, and then we're going to turn it over to allow you to see kind of up close and personal one of the pilots in Ghana. But before I move forward, I just want to remind us, because I forgot to mention, the title of this session is Can an Outcomes-Focused Standard Facilitate Investment and Partnerships that Drive Landscape Sustainability? And I just want to say that's part of the reason I'm really excited to be part of this, having started not too long ago with Verra, just knowing that there's an opportunity to look at an outcome-based standard, not a standard that necessarily dictates exactly what has to happen from an activity or strategy standpoint in any landscape, but one that is more flexible, that allows tailoring based on the conditions at a landscape and the culture in that place. So in a nutshell, the landscape standard is meant to assess holistically the sustainability across dimensions, sectors, and production systems. It can be applied with a variety of different production systems and different types of commodities or ecosystem services and other things like that. It also, as I mentioned, puts a real stress and focus on results and outcomes, so that the objective so that there can be objective validation and verification, but based on results, based on progress, not just based on checking off on a list whether or not you did X, Y, or Z. And also, because we're talking about landscapes here at the Global Landscapes Forum, it's a lot, as Joanna mentioned, a lot about collective action and thinking about what does it take to actually govern and work together and move the ball forward in a landscape, beyond just a single supply chain or commodity or a type of investment. And also, the landscape standard is designed and we're designing it to assess trends in performance, achievement of certain thresholds and milestones, but also progress towards outcomes and continuous improvement. Those are kind of some of the foundational principles behind it. The framework itself is one that is based on kind of the classic pillars, principles, criteria, and indicators, as many standards have, and then allowing for claims and the ability to create messages about claims that are verifiable, that are genuine, not just marketing or greenwashing. And as I mentioned, we've tried to design it in a way that allows for continuous improvement over time, because this is the type of work you need to continue to work on for the long haul, very long haul. We wanted to show you this, not to read every bit of it, but please go ahead and look carefully. But this is really the bedrock of landscape standard, and what it's going to be. How we're designing it is to have 4 main pillars: environmental, production, social, and governance pillars. With it's definitely more detailed than this, but the basic essence of it is that under these pillars, there are a variety of principles that get at some of the most important issues in a landscape, and thinking about what does it take to have a sustainable landscape. And when you look down to the indicator level, you can see most of those will apply in just about any landscape, but not all. Some of those are universal and some are more specific to certain types of landscapes. But we're really excited about this because we're trying to find something that has real meat on its bones, but is flexible enough to use in a variety of landscapes, but is attractive enough to actually invest in and utilize. Also, to make it real and really learn and iterate over time. We're conceiving of the landscape standard as it's a product we're trying to bring to market that enables people to do a better job of conserving and managing landscapes sustainably. But we have several pilots, some of which are in motion already. The green ones here in Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Peru, and Ghana, so pretty heavily in Latin America at the moment. But we're considering other areas such as Kenya, Ethiopia, and Indonesia, and you can see the variety of commodities and types of ecosystem services and issues that we're considering across the globe. Everything from restoration and watershed services in Costa Rica to cocoa in Ghana and palm oil, if we were to work on that in Indonesia, which is under consideration. So, as I mentioned before, the landscape standard is meant to be able to apply to a variety of different management regimes. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Jan Willem so you can learn about what it looks like on the ground as we're learning about how to apply this and develop it in Ghana.
Thanks. Last month, my Facebook popped up a picture of a rugged mountain landscape over the Sahara, in the Sahara. And I took that picture 5 years ago, and it reminded me that 5 years ago, I was with Edith Kish, who was interning at that time with us, because she was in between jobs, and now she's working for Altilia Climate Fund. We both went to Ghana to speak with our partner NCRC, and we spent days sweating away because the air conditioner was not working, but sweating away, talking about the idea of a landscape RED Plus cocoa project that would develop a new asset class, like the climate smart cocoa bean from the landscape in the high forest landscape. And we compared it to the Appellation Contrôlée from French wine, and we were way over our heads. But Olam was involved in discussion, and Robert Bamfou, who was still then at the Forestry Commission. So anyway, I thought, this is not going anywhere. And now this is one initiative, and in those days Rainforest Alliance was also working with Olam on a sort of landscape approach. Solidarity that was doing their own things in Ghana. And look where we are now. I mean, these standards can really be a game changer. In Ghana, where NCRC is testing it in 2 landscapes, NCRC over the last years have worked on Landscape Red Plus that led to the adoption of the Red Plus landscape approach under the FCPF, and they got 40 million funding for that, and that became the basis of the emissions reductions program of the Red Plus Forest program in Ghana. That is really a good foundation for some of this work. And NCRC has done all this work, bringing together various combination of stakeholders, the cooperatives, the traditional chiefs, the Forestry Commission. It took some convincing, but the Cocoa Board also by 2013 end of year was involved. And anyway, so now the landscape standard is tested here in the Kakum area, which is well known for its canopy walk, if anyone has been there. And here the Joabeso area, where various organizations have done various projects with setting up community resource management areas, etc. I'm speaking on behalf of Rebecca Assara from NCRC, our partner. I'm also speaking on behalf of IUCN Netherlands Committee, not IUCN International. IUCN International is partner in the development of the landscape standard. But over the years, I've done a lot of work with NCRC in this general space, and so I can say a little bit about it. And I can share with you the enthusiasm of Rebecca when she says, like, well, you know, this is great. We now have a standard where we monitor and certify impact in various pillars of sustainability. At the moment in the multi-stakeholder group that is doing these tests, the same kind of actors that I mentioned are involved, but also from the cocoa trader companies, it's Tuton, Hershey's, Barry Callebaut, Olam, Cargill, Ecom. All these companies are involved. Of course, so many companies are also involved because of all the other initiatives, like the what is the recent tropical forest, the cocoa forest initiative. So these companies are now under pressure to do something with their zero deforestation commitments. And the interesting thing about this standard, as I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, but you can allow different companies to give the impact that they achieve in terms of zero deforestation and other sustainability impacts. It is up to them how they market it. They can call it climate smart, they can call it a zero deforestation bean, or they can call it something else. Also, these companies in the communities where they source their cocoa, they can apply their own extension services, their sustainability interventions, as long as through the monitoring across the landscape, as long as collectively there's a performance. And if there's performance, then those companies that contribute to that performance can market their bean as being sustainable or deforestation free. And companies or other commodities that don't participate in the initiative, they might benefit from the sustainability transition, but if they don't contribute it, then they can also not use the label. So roughly, this is at least Rebecca's interpretation of the potential. Again, tell me if I'm wrong, because I'm not myself. I mean, we are now going to develop dialogues in the coming year with our program to share the lessons learned and also to share that with policymakers. But NCRC is also excited about these two pilots because they're quite different in land use and rights. So in the Kakum area, it is less complicated than in the Joabeso area. It is a different type of forest, so it allows for different impacts to be monitored. And what they have in common is that there's different levels of data that is already available through, for example, the Red Plus existing initiative and through the Cocoa Forest initiative. And that's, of course, very important because you have to start to make baselines. You have to have a monitoring protocol where you can give transparency and measure your impact. And so that's, of course, an important part of what NCRC is going to do as part of these pilots. So, yeah, very important. As we have seen from a distance in the Netherlands, very important has been the fact that the Forestry Commission at an early stage embraced the idea for a Landscape Red Plus initiative. Very important that the Cocoa Board also came on board in 2013 and started to collaborate with the Forestry Commission, which in itself was an interesting outcome. And of course the companies that are looking for, improving their production and addressing their risks, and all the various NGOs that have collaborated to come to this. Not that they developed the landscape standard, but they laid the groundwork in these two landscapes so that this approach can actually be tested in those two landscapes. And I'm also excited to see this. And as I say, we're going to have dialogues and share the lessons learned from these tests in the coming 2 years. Thanks.
Thank you. And before I pass it over to Louis to moderate, just wanted to say thank you to the German government has helped fund this Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety. So thank you. Really proud of that and pleased to be here. So Louis, go for it.
I'm going to turn this microphone on and we're going to try. I have just probably one question myself that I'll just pose to you guys now that's a sort of clarifying question, and maybe it'll start to elicit some of this other stuff too. And then I really want to hear from you guys because we've got a nice full house here, and I'm sure you have lots of questions and probably smarter questions than I could come up with myself anyway. So we're just going to pass the microphone around and have you guys hammer them. So the one question I had, it occurs to me, so we heard a lot about demand, but there's also, a standards infrastructure that exists in the world already. And I wanted to get a sense from your approach to the complementarity of a landscape standard to supply chain and, the other certifications and standards that are out there. I didn't hear you touch on that a little bit, but obviously, Nigel, sitting from Rainforest Alliance, there's an interest in that, in making sure that there's some kind of complementarity, I imagine. So could you talk a little bit about your approach to that, as such as it is?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. It's important because we're actually measuring something different. It's what's happening in the whole landscape instead of what one particular supply chain or investment is, the impacts they're having. And so, as Nigel mentioned, and we've been hearing from many companies, is that they're increasingly concerned and aware of the sort of broader landscape issues and how that affects their business and their reputations. So if it's widely known that they get a large amount of their products from a particular place, and that even if they say, oh, we're certified for, I don't know, usually 80% or something, on the other hand, if there's widespread knowledge that the forests are disappearing in that part of the world, it gives it has a big impact, and they have concerns about their future sourcing of commodities, etc. So we're talking about slightly different information, and I think it comes down to the extent to which in the future, maybe even more so than now, there'll be more transparency about where things come from. So instead of just saying, oh, sourced from Ethiopia, it's like which bit of Ethiopia and what really is happening in that part of Ethiopia, etc. So we're talking about complementary information that's extremely important for decision making and for reputation and for future business, for business interest. But it's different from the kind of thing that you would assess at the site level, and I give an example. I work in the governance and social side a lot. For example, free, prior and informed consent of local communities or something. In some way, you can't give a blanket that, oh yeah, that whole landscape has, everybody acting in that landscape has obtained free, prior and informed consent. That would probably be impossible, and you'd be very open to the risk of there being one or two that didn't fit it, and that's not acceptable. So, you need to have an assessment for each individual investment or activity for that kind of issue. But other kinds of issues like deforestation, you can look at a broader level. There are and water quality, water regulation. So, some things lend themselves better to broad, to being assessed at a landscape scale, and that is what this framework is focusing on. Anyone want to add anything?
Yeah, I think in addition to the complementarity, they help each other as well, right? So if you've got lots of farm-based certification, sort of our more traditional farm-by-farm certification going on, and you're making good progress on that, that's going to help add up to progress across the landscape and help build momentum towards that. On the other hand, if you've got some really good progress across the landscape as a whole on some key wider institutional aspects, governance aspects, enabling factors that this helps to drive, then that's going to make the on-farm certification easier as well. So they sort of help each other contribute to impact, I think. Yeah.
So with that, I really want to encourage questions from you guys. Does anyone out there have a burning one at this moment? Great. Here, Ruth.
Thank you. Yeah. I can see how those things help each other and that they can be complementary, but fundamentally it doesn't help me manage my risk if I know there's a bigger risk in my landscape and I can't intervene at that level. So then the question is, how does that, I can do individual certification at the local level, but now I know there are these bigger landscape risks, there are other actors involved. If I sit down with all the other actors and we say, yeah, we can do something at a landscape level, yes, we've got this Freerider problem. Oh, people that didn't do anything, now they can say they're in a sustainable landscape as well. I mean, in the end, it's really helpful to be able to make verified claims, but those claims are about who's doing what. And my question is, at that higher landscape level, who's doing it?
Yeah, maybe we'll take a couple and then they can.
I'm not sure. I hope I didn't miss this, but I was wondering, so who would run this and who would pay for running it? And then who actually invests? Because I heard your point about managing risks and making claims, but we also know that this is not intended to sort of shy away from areas, but you would want to sort of trigger commitment and investment. So I wondered, where does that come in here? Thanks.
Yes, just to complement, I think Ruth's question, how about double counting? Because if one company can make some claims, is this at the landscape level? Is this within the supply chain? Is this connected to Rainforest Alliance certification? And then how about the other company, having activities, extension services, as you mentioned, in the same territory? So how about this double counting? Is this connected to a national framework or, of some sorts?
Great, thanks. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm afraid it's always easier to answer the last question.
Of course. Well, I'll come back to Ruth if we don't get to
you
it.
keep them fresh in your mind. But the double counting issue, we're actually talking about a landscape. Like the element that would be assessed would be the landscape and not the company's actions or the product. We're discussing and planning to develop some tool that would help to assess a company's contributions. That's a slightly different thing. But what we're talking about is the sustainability score, or whatever, the sustainability across dimensions of the landscape from which something is sourced, not the product itself. So it's actually the actors within that landscape, so the government and the communities that will be making the producers that are making in that landscape that are making the claim about the whole landscape. And then others are getting information about what they're sourcing from there, and how it comes from, where it comes from, basically. So that one.
Maybe give an example of the kind of thing what a claim could sound like.
And the sort of part that's connected is this Freerider problem, which I think gets to that. It's sort of like, so if you're a company who's interested in building the sustainability of your landscape and you're acting in it, and then there's everyone else can just kind of like sit back, and our score is going to go up because they manage an awful lot of land in this place. How do you deal with that? What's the thinking behind how that?
Yeah. So the big thing we're aiming for is to spur collaboration within the landscape, and at some point you have to get to a point where the players involved there see it as a pre-competitive thing, that they have to get involved there and support sustainability in that landscape, rather in order to get the result that they need for their future business, to the point that they're not just treating it as something that they claim as their contribution. Yeah, so that's where we need to get to. I'm not saying we're there everywhere and it would work perfectly in many places, but it's already working in Ghana. We've seen the companies see it's in their interest to work together with the government, otherwise they won't have the future supply that they need. Yeah, and the producers. And
then I think this connects a little bit to the third question, which was about who's investing and why, and maybe there's a hook to this collaborative, or sort of that's where a little bit of the push comes, less from the consumer side, which is more about the claim making, and more from the investors who are looking, and maybe it's specifically DFIs or governments who have made specific commitments themselves to where they will invest and what kinds of outcomes they expect to see from those investments. How does that connect to what? And then maybe there's who are some of those investors in your mind, if they're not there yet? And maybe in the Ghana case, who are some of those investors?
I'm not up to date what exactly is happening in that sense, but what I do hear from companies is everyone already accepts the idea that you won't be able to pay to sell your sustainable produce for a premium price. That's just very limited for certain crops, maybe in certain products. So as I believe, a lot of companies see this is, first of all, they also look at each other, what they're doing. Even companies that don't have a consumer face. I mean, we work with shea companies. No one knows shea companies that trade shea, but they're looking at each other and they want to do what's best for the landscape. Of course, because it reduced their risks at several fronts. So, but I think that a lot of companies see that they have to safeguard their future production, that improved production and sustainability at per hectare is useful for them. So they will probably invest in improvements in their supply chain and in their production areas. Olam, for example, also says like they want to depend less on trading from areas. They actually want to produce more in their own area. So I think that is where the transformation comes from. So companies will basically invest in it, I think.
Well, just to the very specific point, I'll just clarify. So this is very distinct from the Rainforest Alliance's agricultural certification standard and program. So they're very complementary. So you would not be able to put the Rainforest Alliance seal on a product as part of this program. So it won't get confused at all with the very specific claims that companies can make associated with our ongoing certification work with cocoa, coffee, tea, bananas, and so on, just to clarify that.
Yeah. So ultimately, who is going to take ownership of the result, the label, the result of and potentially pay for it? So ultimately, the ownership, as I was saying, comes from the people within the landscape. So what we're hearing from companies, and it varies with companies because some are much more wedded to and are kind of adopted landscapes that are places where they have either, production facilities, or something. They have a very strong commitment to particular places in the world, and they're already looking at how they could partner with others in that area. So they become part of the group that has ownership of it. In other places they're going to be, more mobile and just sourcing from areas that have, that have the levels of sustainability that are important for their sourcing criteria. And they're going to be less involved, I think, in the kind of ownership of and payment for the actual sort of use of the standard.
I just wanted to quickly add, too, one thing we didn't mention, but we are going to be, as any standard that is developed should have some formal feedback and public consultation mechanism. So we do have that planned for next year to have public consultation. But we also have an advisory group and more informal advisors. So if any of you are interested in posing additional questions to us after this in the next couple of days or emailing us, please do so. We'd love to hear from you and have more brains involved. I think you can think of more questions and scenarios than just a smaller group of us can do alone.
Yeah, I don't want to. Let's just take another round here, and I'll try to summarize again so that we don't have to.
Hello. I suppose like the landscape standard is a tool, right, to change, to solve local landscape problems. So how do we ensure that the landscape is, like the definitions, the indicators, are not dictated by the markets, by the supply chains, but really by the local people and the local, the rural governance that's in place? And another question is, like, for instance, in countries like Costa Rica, they already have very good plans in which they integrate the blue, green, brown agendas. How does this complement, and do you work together with the government on this?
Yeah, maybe if I can just follow up on that, because kind of my question goes in a similar direction. Like, you've used in your presentations the terms jurisdictions and landscapes a little bit interchangingly, but it's obviously not the same. And so my question is, the big equalizer, after all, amongst all actors in a landscape is government. Local government, regional government, national government. So is the standard going to look at the jurisdictional level or all these jurisdictional levels as well? Or is that, just one of the components?
Okay, thanks. I'll say something, and maybe my colleagues have also. But just on the first point, I would say it's not a tool for how to reach sustainability within a landscape. It's actually looking at what are the outcomes of whatever has been done within a landscape. It's just assessing the outcomes in a standardized way with validation and verification of the results, what comes out of that. So there are other tools that help people to work together and to do their strategic planning, etc. So that's the first thing. So as I said before, it's the tool that helps organize and standardize the information that goes from the results in the landscape to the external actors. And then jurisdictional and landscape. It's called a landscape standard. In many of the use cases, it's being used at jurisdictional level. That's the case in Ghana. These jurisdictional components of the larger Ghana cocoa forest landscape. There's one that is not a jurisdiction. That's in Costa Rica, the Aguatica area, a water fund around San Jose. So that happens to follow the watershed for the investment for that water fund. So we've not sort of required it to work in a jurisdiction, but it's a powerful tool for a jurisdictional approach.
Not to go too much into detail, but in Ghana you can argue that it's not a jurisdictional approach because it's not in the sense like, for example, in Indonesia, where you have a whole province that is doing a program. But in Ghana, it is a landscape, but it is a collection of many districts. So it is not like one entity that is one jurisdiction, but it is district by district. And so the pilot areas are also districts that are high impact areas, as they call it. And then when when it will be scaled up, they will add districts. So it's a bit in between. But the jurisdiction is of course always important because of the governance structure.
Thank you very much. I was thinking, how would you go about having already certified areas with other standards? Like, well, I know of a forest project, FSC certified. Also gold standard certified. My colleague here talked about RSPO certified. Now we have a landscape standard. That will be too much, probably. So how will you incorporate all these other already there standards?
Yeah, I think we just come back to the slightly different role that it's playing, because FSC certifies forest products, and forest management units, and RSPO is for the production of palm oil. But we're looking at in a landscape, for example, in one of the landscapes in Peru, there's cocoa, oil palm, and coffee, all roughly similar impacts on the landscape in slightly different ways. So we're not talking about one commodity driving all the deforestation and being, it's a bit different from the Ghana case. So we're talking about cases where you have several different commodities or sectors that are affecting deforestation, and then, but for your coffee producers in that area, it matters to them what the other sectors are doing, but at the moment they don't have any way of understanding the collective impact, and this is a way of understanding them. So it's playing a different role from the commodity production or the farm-to-farm level certification.
But then you will get that the area will be like cleared at the landscape level. Let's say we have 10,000 hectares. 5,000 hectares palm oil, RSPO. Then you have 5,000 areas cleared, correct? And then you have 5,000 to go for the landscape standard. So I'm not sure if I'm getting the right, but we can talk about it later. So we don't.
I didn't want to interrupt, but I think the idea is that while RSPO has specific criteria around practices and even around some outcomes on those particular lands, but those aren't necessarily correlated to landscape scale outcomes for water or for all of the different metrics that would be included in the landscape standard. And so you would want to look across the whole area to see how much are those practices contributing, and then ideally to catalyze or incentivize the palm oil producers to be engaged in a broader process that says what else can we do, or how can we do what we do a little bit differently so that we achieve better landscape scale outcomes beyond our own production area, for instance. So that I would be curious to hear about some of the pilots and maybe a little bit of comment on the mechanisms by which that incentive is working. I think we heard a little bit about it in Ghana. Just the incentive to come to the table around something bigger than your own production area starts to get a lot of this going in ways that it doesn't that might be useful in and of itself. But I think if there's maybe some other examples might clarify that if there's other cases. And anyone else have a question related, or I'll turn it to that just now. Yeah.
Just a couple of comments. We know that the voluntary standards have made excellent job. Not very perfect, but excellent job in different commodities. But in the Solidaridad perspective, it's not enough. That means that is the reason that a lot of session here regarding landscape. That means impacts into the landscape level come from different actors in the landscape per se. But we know that there is more powerful drivers in terms of economic in agriculture. Depends on the sugarcane, the cocoa, whatever, you know. I think the advantage to have a tangible metrics regarding landscape standard is to measure how the performance, not just for a specific commodity, is for all actors in the landscape. That means that's the issue. Maybe we need to have more conversation with the global market that the impacts in terms of sustainability is not just for to establishment RSPO or Bonsucro or UTS or, you know. That means it's a time that we need to think if they are willing, the global market is willing to provide more, how to say, no support, more beyond the commodity, because water, for example, is not produced exactly in that area where the commodity is produced. It's come from the watershed. It's come from, you know me? It's the same case with biodiversity, you know? That means, but that's the challenge right now. That's the reason that we have 7 pilot projects, and Solidaridad is part of this consortium, trying to raise opinions, trying to raise, the voice from several actors for several countries to improve the concept and to improve is the right way, you know. That means it's very complex. We know, yeah. It's like, for example, I send to you to other country and to measure all sustainable development goals, which is regarding to 17 goals. You have a problem because you don't have a lot of methodology. You have a clear what kind of indicator are more powerful than others, for example. Do you know what I mean, sense? Yeah, that's the thing. If we are willing in the distillery of indicators, we can to discover the more powerful indicators who can to accommodate for most of landscape as possible. Maybe we can to provide, if we are moving for sustainable landscape, using more powerful indicators, and then if United Nations or international banks or global market are willing to provide more support in terms to development issue, not per se. Of course, they are diminish the risk in terms to diminish reputation, for example, to diminish or to increase inclusiveness. You know, there is a lot of, you know, variables that we need to discuss. But for me, it's in my perspective, you know. So that is the exercise. It takes time, but we introduce the concept. When we have more information, maybe in 1 year later.
Thank you, Flavio. So Flavio is participating in the team at Solidaridad in Guatemala in the pilot case for landscape standard, and yeah. So, but I think you really put your finger on it when you said we're looking for the powerful indicators, you know, of landscape sustainability in a holistic way. So just as we want that providing credible information about landscape performance, we want that to stimulate collective action and coming together. We're asking for a collective process also to help us home in on the right indicators. We're coming up with something, you know, through our standards experience as a big group of NGOs working with pilot cases, and we'll be putting that into the public domain in early next year. And we're looking for even people who are interested to review the early drafts and provide us with feedback, because it's not something that can be done by one organization. We're all here talking about landscape performance and landscape sustainability throughout the Global Landscape Forum. We know of many, many pilots out there, so let's come together and try to build something that represents something that we all, that builds on our collective knowledge and experience and we can use in the future together. So we look forward to, please contact us and we look forward to working with you all on this and bringing more people into this partnership. Thank you.
So with that, I think that's a great invitation to close on. So thank you, Joanna, for doing that. I want to just do a couple of an invitation to, if you would like to talk to any, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but there's also, we've sort of created a space over there just outside and to the right for good opportunities for face-to-face interaction. If there were questions you had that you didn't want to be brave and stand up and shout in front of everyone, and you want to pose something a little bit intricate to somebody, you're welcome to sort of, I think we're just going to send them over there, and so we can clear out this space and you can go and have face-to-face conversation in a very sort of dedicated area, and you don't all have to be there, but it would be lovely if you could do that. Yes, and there's also a booth here that will be, Verra is manning all weekend. So tomorrow, if your question occurs to you overnight tonight, you can come find them there tomorrow. Also, and then all throughout the day, the rest of the day today, and into tomorrow, I want to flag a couple of things. One, on the wall here to the right, there's a jargon board that's popping up. We're at the Inclusive Finance and Business Engagement Pavilion in a conference where I think I saw like 75% of the people in the last session raise their hand and say that I'm from an NGO. So if you don't understand something that someone says about finance here at the pavilion in another session, and you want someone to answer that, to try to define a term for you, you hear it all the time and you just don't know if you actually know what it means, but it gets bandied around. Put it on the wall there, and then we're going to do a blog post, but we'll also be having people they think they know what the term means, writing definitions on sticky notes and putting them up throughout the rest of the weekend too. So I encourage you to engage throughout the pavilion that way. And also, all of these sessions are being recorded, which is why we're using the microphones, even though it's a nice tight space. So if there's something you want to revisit later, I encourage you to check out the Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature's website, and we'll have links to all of the recordings for all the sessions and everything too. Yes, and Nigel, just briefly. Are you finished? I am, yes.
I just if we're finished, I just want to flag that we have a great session at 6 o'clock. If you liked this, you'll love that one on supply chains and restoration. It's one of the parallel sessions at 6 o'clock in Nairobi 1 and 2. And Sophie, you should wave as well. Sophie Percy is also part of the team working on this. She's just taken over internally, managing this on the Rainforest Alliance side in partnership with our colleagues here. So Sophie's also here to talk. Thanks.
Thank you all, everyone. An applause for our panel. Yeah.